That's right. Thank you very much for the introduction. I've recently started as a PhD student in Leicester, but I think it will be very evident at the end of this presentation who was my professor of prehistory for the past 4 years, because a lot of the points I will be making have also already been touched upon by Hadi in his first talk. In the paper I will present today, I'll be discussing the concept of settlement continuity. Usually this is seen as a relatively unproblematic concept, but I hope to make the point that a more theoretically explicit perspective of what settlement continuity is might enable us to better understand how this takes place on multiple scales of analysis, so multiple temporal scales, the shorter scale and the longer scale. So I'll be deconstructing this concept and trying to offer a usable alternative for how to do this, and I'll try to illustrate this with, again, a case study from Westfrisia, which we've already seen as well in an earlier talk. First of all, what is it what we talk about when we discuss settlement continuity? Usually it's situations like this, where you see multiple phases of inhabitation succeeding each other, and despite the often considerable time depth which characterizes these configurations of houses, these situations have been approached as single settlements. So the implicit or explicit assumption being that these different settlement phases are connected through time somehow, in order to argue for settlement continuity. Now, the point I'm making here today is not necessarily that this is wrong. In these cases, I'd even argue that the fact that there's some sort of settlement continuity is self-evident. But I think the concept can be explored further by asking why and how settlement continuity occurs. Now, in order to do this, I think it's helpful to ask why we might want to investigate settlement continuity in the first place. Now, there are no clear textbooks who offer simplistic guidelines as to how to do this, but several aims can be identified. The first and perhaps the most common way in which we discuss settlement continuity is during the creation of descriptive accounts of settlements, which often serve as the groundwork for further analysis. And here the question that's asked is, were they, and here they is referring to a traditional house building or a cultural group, were they here and how long were they here, or was it at some point a different day, a different tradition, cultural group, etc. And in this case, continuity is descriptive, it's not explanatory. This type of research coincides with analytically delineating settlement phases, assigning house plans and other features to these phases, phases to subperiods, subperiods to periods, and periods are associated with cultural groups. Now, this type of question hardly concerns itself with why people moved from one location to the other. Likewise, even though the question to which archaeologically delineated period houses or features belong can lead to situations where continuity or discontinuity is described, the reasons behind continuity or change often remain unexplored. For this reason, I've named this type of dealing with continuity an implicit and descriptive mode. As you'd expect, there's also an explicit mode of dealing with descriptions of continuity. And it's often used as a system trying to deduce settlement systems. In the by now classical method proposed by Kent Flannery, the analysis of excavated settlement patterns can lead to more general statements about settlement systems. For instance, we might say late Neolithic houses are often found on creek ridges, and this might be contrasted with phases further removed in time. For instance, we might also say Middle Bronze Age houses are also frequently found in upland regions. This creates the possibility to argue for continuity or discontinuity in settlement systems, and by doing so, smaller differences in time are collapsed in order to make visible some sort of core logic underlying the placement of these settlements. But this method of research can also be said to have its drawbacks. This conflates short-term settlement dynamics into a single, quite often arbitrarily chosen phase, and the method often only lends itself to explaining continuity or discontinuity in terms of ecological determinism on a more regional scale, but it does little to explain the workings of continuity on the scale of the settlement itself. Now, in some instances, continuity is also investigated more explicitly with the aim of explaining why there is continuity or discontinuity. And one of the ways in which this is done is via the persistent place perspective, coined by Schlanger in the early 90s. Now, his interpretation of what a persistent place might be is a place that is used repeatedly during long-term occupation of a region. It's, of course, very broad. But this was later reiterated by Thomas, who defined several elements which a persistent place might have, and that's its physical conditions and its resources, but also natural or cultural features which might structure reuse. And this place is created through practice over an extended period of time. So here we're already moving towards the how of a persistent place. But this term is mostly been applied to the long-term timescales associated with the archaeology of hunter-gatherers. But I think it can equally be applied to settlement archaeology. For instance, recognizing what characterizes persistent settlement places on a regional scale allows for a more complete analysis of the causes behind discontinuity in settlement systems, as one can analyze what exactly is changing between one settlement system and the other. However, it's important to recognize that this concept is mostly aimed at continuity in the broadest sense. It's used to ask why places were reused over a longer period of time, regardless of the shape or form of this reuse. Now, specifically, the cultural potential for features to structure reuse is taken up, of course, by Fokke Gerritsen, whose house biographical approach has already been featured several times at this conference. And in this approach, he highlights how houses might have been used to emphasize relations to the past through patterns of reuse or abandonment. His hypothetical durable house is one which retains significance over time as a focal point for narratives which are of importance to the associated social group. And this remains so even after the abandonment of the house itself. Now, what both of these approaches emphasize is that settlements and places in general do not only exist spatially in relation to other settlements and geography, but they extend themselves temporally as well. They are not constructed in a temporal vacuum, but exist within a constructed world where life is already taking place in relation to its past and in anticipation of its future. However, the methods proposed by Schlanger and Gerritsen use different analytical focal points. This distinction is somewhat of a curious one. On the one hand, Gerritsen's house biography focuses on the smaller scale of the individual house, meaning its analytical interest ends shortly after the abandonment of the house. On the other hand, his aims lie with recognizing an idealized house. It's an idealized house biography, not of one, not of several, but of a house in general, the house. And the relation between the scales of analysis of the single house, the idealized house, and the longer-term persistent place is still very much unexplored. Now, the life biographical approach being the topic here today, other speakers have already shown the strength of this approach. But also the descriptive aims I've talked about earlier are not necessarily wrong in themselves. Despite the fact that macroscale analyses of cultural groups have fallen out of favor, no one would argue that there isn't some sort of level of comparability between roughly contemporary or subsequent settlements from the same region. Similarly, the regional scale comparison between settlement systems to argue for continuity or discontinuity does not seem particularly problematic. But when the methods associated with these aims show a clear preference for the longer term analysis, and these do not include ideas about how continuity might be maintained from one settlement phase to the next. So the apparent simplicity of these arguments becomes more complex when we ask how this process might work from the ground up. So what might this situations like this one, how might these have been created? How does it work from the ground up? According to the larger scale analyses, the continuous resettlement of these sites might in part be explained on a regional scale by slow rhythms of ecological push and pull factors, but this does not explain the day-to-day logic of why and how people abandoned and reused settlements in culturally specific ways. Conversely, this short-term house-centric scale of analysis associated with the life-biographical approach does not go into how the abandoned house might relate to any other long-term place persistence other than one reflecting back upon its own use, because the house is the analytical focal point of a house-biographical approach. And this then brings us to the core of the problem. We assume the existence of longer scale continuity or discontinuity, and often this is based on typological similarities or dissimilarities, but we haven't really theorized the short scale workings of how this came to be. Now here I make a comparable point has already been made by, for instance, John Robb and Tim Pocketet and Jan Harding and my PhD supervisor Oliver Harris and Rachel Krellin, who state that in archaeological research, the anthropological present, meaning a short-scale study of the here and now, has been disconnected from the deeper histories of the people we study. The general critique offered by these people entails that we have focused on snapshots of curiously timeless ethnographic worlds that succeed one another without any real discussion of the reasons or mechanisms of change. So we have the individual phases we study, but what happens in between remains somewhat unexplored. Now, what does an archaeology which takes this into account look like? The more implicit and descriptive ways of dealing with settlement continuity fails to address the processes driving behind the spatial reproduction of the societies we study. When these processes are studied, instead of only describing the end result, the question becomes focused on how temporal gaps between settlement phases are connected. Practically put, this means asking whether or not there was intentional reuse of space and which aspects of this reuse were practiced in what ways. Now, obviously, this is already quite similar to the house-biographical approach, which we've already talked about earlier. But it's not exactly the same. Where the house-biographical approach is aimed to identify the idealized trajectory that, for instance, an Iron Age house might take throughout its use life, I instead propose to analyze if and how various individual place biographies connect and refer to each other. This changes the scope of the analysis from a single or idealized house to ask how settlement landscapes might have been left behind after abandonment, and how these landscapes were reused afterwards. The house is thus no longer preferred as an analytical unit above the rest of the settlement, but individual house biography is only seen as a short phase in the longer-term dynamics of the settlement. To illustrate this point, I will discuss a settlement biography of the site of Enkhuizen, which was excavated in 2009 to 2010, I think. That's again found in the Western Netherlands in West Frisia, over by the dot you see in the small image in the right corner. Now, the part of the site under investigation dates to 1400 to 1200 BC, placing it in the last part of the Dutch Middle Bronze Age. But because of dating problems, the houses within this can't be phased with C14 dating, but mostly with features overcutting each other. And at this site, 15 houses were recognized during the excavation. These are spread between 12 house sites. So that means some houses were built exactly on top of each other, like what you see here on this image. The exact use life of these houses is not known, but it's estimated that no more than 2 or 3 would have been present in the settlement contemporaneously. And outside of these houses, the site is interconnected by countless of ditches. And together these form a settlement ditch network, joining houses and watering pits and wells, and also even a barrow. This was also already shown in a different site, Westfrisian, which Harry showed this earlier this morning. Here you see how the site is also connected by ditches, and this is the site of Westfrisian where you see them being excavated and drawn. So I asked 3 basic questions, and these are mostly focused on abandonment and reuse. Now, obviously, the use of the houses themselves is also a part of this, but I am sure that Yvonne will be talking about this in her talk, how houses might have been used and conceptualized, etc. Now, the analysis of the houses focused on earth-fast posts used as foundation of the roof, but also on short house ditches parallel to the houses, and these are not to be confused with the settlement ditches which you see here. Here in red, alongside the house, you see house ditches which are, for instance, used to regulate water runoff from the roofs. Not their only purpose, but... And here we see a relatively uniform way of dealing with house abandonment. Various ways are used to remove posts from the soil, but eventually all posts were removed, meaning that the house was pulled from the ground and destroyed, or at least removed. And likewise, at the end of the use life, the house ditches next to the house were filled up. The uniformity of these practices suggests an intent to erase the house after abandonment, not leaving a recognizable remnant of the past. And occasionally, ditches and post holes can be subject to depositional practice as well. This can involve small-scale depositions of pottery or animal bone remains, which might, for instance, be dumping practices of waste, but one is more hard-pressed to make this case when the deposition of human remains is involved. Partial human remains are found in 3 houses, including one where human remains were repeatedly deposited in the same location during different moments after the abandonment of the house. Other examples of potential ritual deposition occur in the form of extremely large amounts of pottery or animal remain depositions, whereas most features associated with the house contain hardly any finds. A select few from a few houses yield many kilos of finds, including intact pots and cranial remains of animals. And often these are found in the tops of ditches associated with the house, so that indicates that their deposition took place shortly before the ditches were filled up completely. Now the settlement ditches interconnecting the settlement show a comparable way of use and abandonment. The individual settlement ditches were also filled up at the end of their use lives, and they feature the same classes of features inside of them, and they're also located in the tops of the features, which means their deposition again took place shortly before their abandonment, and this includes pottery and animal remains, but as you see from the skull here, also human remains. Now, taken individually, the house sites and the ditches at the Huizen Gedijken might seem to indicate a discontinuity of practices. Every use phase is followed by the erasure of the feature, which might imply that later habitational phases involved a reinterpretation of the landscape without taking previous habitation into account. However, when taking the reuse of space into account, this seems unlikely. Firstly, there are these sequences of house building at the same site. Here, the removal of the first house was followed by the erection of another, and these phases must have succeeded each other relatively quickly. because they all follow the same axis, meaning they still at least knew where the previous house was. And this extends the longevity of this house site up to dozens of years, meaning these multi-phased house sites were stable entities, whilst other houses were erected and disappeared in their vicinity. That the settlement ditches can also be seen as more stable elements in the landscape. No matter how long or short the lifespans of individual ditches, the patterns of ditches interconnecting the settlement spaces were slow to move. Instead of single ditches, we often encounter bundles of ditches, meaning new ones were redug upon the filling of the previous one. The many phases of redigging of these ditches and their clearly recognizable patterns indicate that settlement ditches were more long-lasting than the houses found between them. Now, the importance of placing houses near settlement ditches, instead of placing ditches near houses, is also visible from examples from, for instance, the site Boven-Karspel, where house ditches are placed on top of existing settlement ditches. These ditches therefore seem to have guided the possibilities of where houses could potentially have been constructed. Now, an interesting occurrence takes place where ditches in abandoned houses interconnect. Among the relatively small sample of 12 house sites at Enkhuizen, 3 instances can be identified where new settlement ditches were redug directly on top of previous house ditches. This is what that looks like. The top picture is the house in use, and in the bottom, the house has been abandoned and a new settlement ditch was recut directly on top of the previous house ditch. This is another example of this. So here, the relatively short life biographies of the house become part of the longer and more stable settlement ditch network. Analogies with nearby sites show that this was not just for the single-phased house plans, but also for multi-phased house plans. Now, the interconnected biographies of house plans and settlement ditch networks shed new light on the abandonment practices encountered in both houses and ditches. In both cases, the same type of assemblages are found in the same type of depositional circumstance. Large amounts of faunal remains, pottery, and sometimes human remains were selected to be deposited in these features upon the closure of the feature and the end of its use life. The abandonment process of the house thus effectively mimicked the abandonment process of settlement ditches. Even in the case where houses and settlement ditches did not connect physically, these features were equalized in practice. Coming back to the subject of settlement continuity, this means we cannot speak of the erasure of the house, but of the reconstitution of a relatively short-living house to become a part of a longer-lasting network of settlement ditches. When we envision this process within the life biographical scheme proposed by Gerritsen, the image doesn't look like the original here on the right anymore, but it looks a little bit more like what I show here in this extremely ugly animation. As you see, the biography of the house becomes part of a larger and long-lasting biography. And here I make the biography of the settlement ditch network cyclical to demonstrate its stability. But of course, this as well comes to an end at some point as a new trajectory for the site is taken. Now, when we return to the definition of a persistent place as something which is structured by certain cultural features for reuse and is created through practice over time, we can state that we have identified at least partly how, together with the short-scale life trajectories of individual houses and other features, a longer-lasting cultural feature is created which encourages reuse, which bridges the gap between isolated use phases towards a more persistent place. Now, the main point I hope to have made during this presentation is that the causes of continuity are to be questioned rather than assumed. I also hope to have shown that this can be done by repurposing the biographical approach, not to deal with one idealized house biography, but also by drawing inspiration from the persistent place concept to see how such a place might emerge from multiple individual life biographies from a multitude of objects. Continuity in this sense becomes more than a sequence of static phases separated by archaeological typologies, but it becomes a process which can be questioned and understood.
much.